They said you changed first, whispered it to friends, murmured it to strangers, spoke it as truth before anyone asked for your side. But let's pause for a moment, not to defend you, no, you don't need that. Let's pause to observe. Why is it that the moment you started choosing silence over chaos, distance over disrespect, peace over pleasing, you became the problem? Isn't it strange how people only start calling it change when you stop allowing the version of yourself that served them? They didn't tell the world you changed because it was true. They told the world because they knew the truth would burn them alive, so they rushed ahead, painted your growth as betrayal and your clarity as cruelty. And now here you stand, blamed for the very transformation that saved your soul. They needed a villain before the truth caught up. They didn't tell people you changed because they believed it. They told them because they had to. Because if they didn't speak first, someone might start asking the wrong questions. Someone might get too close to the real story, and that terrified them, so they rushed. They hurried to every friend, every room, every sympathetic ear, just to say, they're different now. I don't know what happened to them. But what really happened? You stopped bleeding for people who never brought you a bandage. You stopped making excuses for behavior that quietly destroyed your peace. You stopped performing, and suddenly their mask was at risk of slipping. So what did they do? They built a shield, a narrative, a lie cleverly stitched together with pieces of truth, just enough to sound real, just enough to stain your name before you even spoke a word, because the truth makes them uncomfortable. The truth puts them in a corner they can't escape. Because in truth they pushed you, in truth they drained you, in truth they only loved the version of you that didn't challenge them, and when you started to pull away, not in anger but in exhaustion, they had to cover their tracks. They couldn't let anyone know they lost access to you because they failed to honor you. No, that version of events would make them the reason the story fell apart. So they crafted a tale that would protect their reflection. They made you out to be bitter, cold, self-absorbed, and maybe people believed it. Maybe they still do, but here's what they'll never admit. They were never afraid of your change. They were afraid of your voice. They were afraid of what you might reveal if you ever told your story without flinching. So they built a preemptive defense. You've changed. They cried, hoping the world would nod along. Because if they say it enough, maybe, just maybe, they'll never have to answer for what made you walk away in the first place. But the ones who truly know you, the ones who feel energy more than they follow gossip, they can see it. They see your calm wasn't born from arrogance, but from survival. They see that your silence wasn't cold, it was sacred. It was earned. And when they look into your eyes, they don't see a person who changed too much. They see someone who finally returned to themselves. The truth is, you didn't change first. You were changed by what you endured. And when you finally chose to no longer carry what wasn't yours, they panicked. Because for the first time, they had to sit with the consequences of losing someone who was never meant to stay broken. Your growth made them feel small. They said you changed. But the truth they won't admit, even to themselves, is far more uncomfortable. You evolved. You didn't wake up and decide to become someone new. You woke up and decided to stop pretending. You grew out of survival. You grew because staying the same meant staying stuck, and your growth, your quiet, unapologetic rising, became unbearable for those who had grown comfortable with your shrinking. You see, they were never rooting for the real you. They were rooting for the version that said yes when you meant no, that smiled when you were exhausted, that laughed off pain just to keep the peace. The version of you that could be molded, managed, and manipulated, the one that made their world easier, at the cost of your own soul. But then something shifted. Maybe it was a breaking point. Maybe it was a moment of stillness where the weight of it all finally caught up. Or maybe it was just time. Either way, you stopped playing the part. You stopped showing up half alive just to be liked. You started setting boundaries not because you were angry, but because you were healing. You started asking questions not to stir conflict, but to understand why you tolerated so much, and that terrified them, because your growth held up a mirror they weren't ready to face. Every step you took towards self-respect, every layer of your old self you peeled away, made their comfort feel exposed. Suddenly, they weren't dealing with someone they could predict. They were dealing with someone who had woken up. Someone who realized that love without respect is a cage, that being needed is not the same as being valued, that peace isn't found in pleasing people, it's found in choosing yourself, and once you chose you, they couldn't reach you the same way. So, what did they do? They labeled your healing as distance, your clarity as attitude, your no as betrayal, because it's easier to call you difficult than to admit they were benefiting from your silence. It's easier to say you changed than to say you outgrew the dysfunction they called normal. Deep down they knew your growth meant they couldn't hold power over you anymore, and power, not love, was what they were really after. So yes, you changed, but not into someone worse. You changed into someone awake, someone who doesn't flinch at guilt, trips or bend under manipulation, someone who walks away, not in anger, but in peace. Because you finally understood, real love doesn't punish growth, it celebrates it. Real connection isn't afraid of your light, it rises with it. So let them whisper, let them say, you're not the same. They're right, you're not. And that's the most beautiful thing that ever happened to you. They spoke first, so you couldn't speak at all, they didn't wait. The moment you pulled away, even just slightly, they moved quickly. Not to reach out, not to understand, but to speak, to tell, to shape the story before it ever had a chance to breathe. Because they knew if people heard your side, their carefully polished image would crack. They knew that if you ever found the courage to explain, not scream, not accuse, just explain, then everything they built on charm, on sympathy, on performance, would fall. So they spoke first. They made themselves the narrator of a story that didn't belong to them. They painted themselves as confused, concerned, wounded, the kind soul who did everything they could, before you, out of nowhere, became cold, distant, unreasonable. It was all so convenient, the timing. The tone, the tears, because in their version there was no cause. Just your sudden change, no history, just your mysterious silence, but you know what they did. You remember the small ways they chipped away at your spirit while smiling to the world. You remember how they twisted your boundaries into betrayal, how they turned your exhaustion into drama, how they danced between cruelty and charm so masterfully that even you began to doubt your own pain. And the moment you stepped back to breathe, to find yourself again, they pounced, because silence gives them room, distance gives them power, and the absence of your voice gives them freedom to invent a new version of you. One that fits their script, one that makes them the misunderstood hero and you the unstable villain. And perhaps the most painful part, some people believed them, some people didn't ask questions, they just listened, because the first voice often becomes the trusted one. And they used that, they counted on that, they weaponized it, but deep down, you knew it wasn't about you changing, it was about them being exposed. Your quiet eggs, it was a threat, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Because it meant you saw them, clearly, fully, and you no longer needed their approval to breathe. So yes, they told everyone before you could. They controlled the narrative so you'd question your own. But here's what they didn't expect. Time has a way of peeling paint. The truth always leaves residue, and even the best actors can't hold a mask forever. Eventually, your absence will begin to speak louder than their version of your story. People will see who healed and who hid, who grew and who lied, and one day, perhaps without a word, your calm, your peace, your quiet strength will tell the real story, and those who matter will understand. You never needed to speak louder, you just needed to wait for the noise to fade, They called it arrogance when you finally chose yourself the moment you stopped explaining yourself. They said you'd become arrogant. The second you stopped over-apologizing for your boundaries, they whispered that you were selfish. When you chose your peace over their approval, they said you were cold. But they never once asked what it cost you to be the version of yourself they now miss. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you that bent quietly, that forgave quickly, that broke silently so they could stay whole. You see, they called it change because they couldn't recognize you without your wounds. They couldn't accept a version of you that no longer begged to be understood, because that version no longer existed to serve their comfort. It never had anything to do with ego. It was never about being better than them. It was about survival, healing, returning to your core. You learned to say no, not because you became difficult, but because you finally understood the weight of always saying yes to what hurt. You walked away not because you lacked love, but because you finally realized that love without respect is just manipulation dressed in poetry, but they couldn't see that. They were too focused on the power they lost when you grew. Because let's be honest, they only ever admired your light when it didn't shine too bright. They only applauded your strength when it worked in their favor. The moment you turned that strength inward, they recoiled. You became too much, too distant, too proud. No, what you became was whole, and they didn't know how to love you without your wounds wide open. So they criticized what they didn't understand. They mistook your calm for pride, your silence for coldness. But what they didn't see was that you had finally found peace in the solitude they tried to shame you for. You had finally built a life where you didn't need constant permission to exist as you are. And in their world, where love is control and presence is a performance, that made you dangerous. So they rewrote your freedom as arrogance, because it was easier than admitting they never truly saw you. Easier than admitting they only loved you when it was convenient. But here's what matters now. You no longer owe anyone an explanation for the way you protect your peace. You don't need to shrink just to make others feel tall. You don't need to soften what took years to rebuild. If they call it arrogance, let them. If they call it distance, so be it. The ones who truly love you will recognize that you didn't become arrogant. You became aligned. With your worth, with your truth, with the quiet, steady fire that says, I am no longer living to be understood by people who only listened when I whispered. They weren't hurt by your distance. They were hurt by your evolution. They say they don't recognize you anymore. That you're not the same, that you've grown distant, detached, maybe even cold. But what they fail to understand, or perhaps refuse to admit, is that it's not distance that unsettles them. It's elevation. They say they miss how things used to be, but if you look closer, what they really miss is the version of you that asked for less, expected less, tolerated more, the version that laughed through discomfort, stayed through disrespect, and held space for people who never once held space for you. And when that version of you began to fade, when your eyes stopped searching for their approval, when your voice no longer trembled in the face of their disapproval, they mistook that healing for disconnection. But you didn't disconnect from them. You reconnected with yourself. And that shift changed everything, because real growth isn't loud, it's quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It simply stops responding to what no longer aligns. And that quiet terrified them, not because you turned bitter, but because you turned inward. You stopped begging to be chosen. You stopped proving your worth. You stopped shrinking. And they didn't know how to relate to this version of you, the one who doesn't entertain manipulation, doesn't chase affection, doesn't live for crumbs. You see, for so long, they confused comfort with connection. But what made them comfortable was never the real you. It was the version that abandoned your needs to meet theirs. When you started honoring your truth, your energy changed, not in spite, not in pride, in peace, And peace has a sound to it that unsettles the ones who are used to chaos, the ones who knew how to read your people, pleasing, but never took time to read your pain. So now, when you say less, they call you distant. When you ask for more, they call you demanding. When you walk away, they call you selfish. But none of those labels belong to you, because the truth is, they were never in love with your spirit. They were in love with your silence, your compliance, your capacity to make them feel big, even if it meant making yourself feel small. But that chapter is closed now. You're not who you used to be, and you shouldn't be. That's not failure. That's freedom. So let them mourn the version of you that made their life easier. Let them grieve the days when you tolerated what broke you, because you didn't change to hurt them. You changed because staying the same was hurting you. And you deserve a life that doesn't demand your suffering in exchange for connection. A life where your evolution is not a threat, but a triumph.